I do.
Yeah, well, I'm not offended. I did a bookstore gig and there were 5 people
Right.
around. I'm like, oh, I got them for a basketball team.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to what is both the second talk in this semester's Contemporary History Institute speaker series and the first that we sort of jointly hosting with the School of Journalism. Our speaker this afternoon, Ray Locker, of course, is an alum of the J School with a master's in the mid-1980s. It's a great pleasure to introduce Ray Locker, Cincinnati native who earned an MS in journalism here in 1984, went on to work for newspapers in Montgomery, Alabama, Tampa, Florida, Los Angeles, eventually becoming the Associated Press's Sacramento bureau chief, and in the mid-2000s, USA Today's national security editor, and then later the same paper's White House and also Washington Enterprise editor. Today, Locker works as a consultant with the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, which aims to enhance education and public awareness of Japanese-American confinement during World War II. Now, while Ray Locker may have stood out among Washington correspondents in the past 2 decades, he also developed a side business as a historian, and there's a little bit of maybe a hope of history repeating itself in this that I'm not going to go into in great depth, but drawn to Washington politics or perhaps to explore to what extent the present differs from the past, Locker began writing books on the Nixon administration. To date, he's published 2, Nixon's Scandal, How Our President's Own Secret Government Destroyed His Administration, and his new book, which came out in May, Haig's Coup, How Richard Nixon's closest aide forced him from office. Suppose where is Haig when you need him, but of course he died 9 years ago. This afternoon he'll give us a sense of what reporting is like in Washington circa 2019. The talk is titled Breaking News in Washington and with the Trump Administration. Please join me in welcoming Ray Locker back to Athens.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. I got this PowerPoint here. I'm not going to really talk a lot about it, but I'm going to start out with this thing because it speaks to what it's like to cover news in Washington and in the Trump administration. We did this story 5 years ago at USA Today. I always like to talk about it because it's done by a fellow OU alumnus, Gregory Cordy, who got his bachelor's degree here. An absolutely awesome reporter who's now at Bloomberg covering the White House. I'd known him for a while, but he didn't work for me then, wasn't part of my team. I was on a vacation in Mexico trying to chill out without my phone. I did get some phone reception, some internet. I got this email. And basically what my boss did was totally reorganize my team of reporters without telling me. I inherited the White House team again, and Gregory, which was great because he's an awesome reporter, but he'd never covered the White House before. So one of the things we did when we first met was, how are we going to do this when you don't know anybody there? No one's leaking to you. How do we master the flow of information that comes out of any of these government agencies, in particular the White House, to our advantage? And basically, if you cover a government agency, there are all these pipelines of information that shoot out stuff that most people don't really know about, they don't pay attention to, routine reports and stuff. And in this case, what we decided to do was, who does President Obama talk to when there's an emergency? Because this was right at the time when there was the Crimea crisis, and we wanted to know what was he doing about it. And so we gathered together almost 1,100 publicly disclosed readouts of Obama's calls with foreign leaders. And up until last year, administrations, Republicans and Democrats, routinely put these out. So if George W. Bush talked to Vladimir Putin, there would be a readout. If Obama did the same, there would be a readout. Not always that illuminating, but you would know that they talked, and in general, what they talked about and when they talked. So we analyzed that to show, who does Obama talk to? We had a cool graphic. It was our own. It was based on information that they put out, but that we could massage to suit our purposes, in an interesting way. And it gave us also the advantage with a White House with whom this reporter didn't have much of a relationship, to show them that he was a person to be reckoned with, that he had the ability to gather information without them giving it to him, making sense of it, and forcing them to respond to his questions. And so that was, the big thing that gave us an advantage. Go back to last year, this administration stopped giving readouts. Now, there were a few reasons. One was that President Trump, early on in his presidency, had talked to some foreign leaders, said one thing in his readout, and then the other country said, that's not what we talked about. In one case with Enrique Peña Nieto in Mexico, the other with Malcolm Turnbull of Australia, in which Trump basically yelled at Turnbull for 20 minutes, and it leaks out that there's this damaging, crazy call, and what happens all the time with this administration is there's a scoop like that, there's the routine denial that it ever happened, and then they confirm it later, and then they try to justify why they did what they previously had denied ever having done. So, middle of last year, here comes this announcement, no more readouts. And it explains why. It's definitely not temporary, it's permanent. And now here we get to what's happened in the last week, why it matters. In July, the president talked to a foreign leader and said something considered so damaging, so off the wall, that somebody aware of that conversation filed a whistleblower complaint with the Inspector General of the intelligence community, saying that the president had promised something that was untoward. There were subsequent reporters where it says, some more details about it. Pretty soon, we know this. Where is it? It was Ukraine that he was talking to. He had frozen aid to the government of Ukraine, which is fighting an insurgency sponsored by the Russians. He had frozen money to help them because he wanted Ukraine to investigate alleged corruption involving Joe Biden's son. Now, basically, anybody who's aware of it knows that there wasn't any corruption involving Joe Biden's son, and he didn't want the Ukrainian officials to report to people at the State Department. He wanted them to report to his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York. In no world is that normal. And the reason why it was so hard to figure out is there were no readouts indicating that there was a conversation. And so all this comes together, now because it seems so damaging. And initially they denied that it happened, then they confirmed that it happened, and as you see over the last couple of days, tried to justify why it happened with misleading or false claims about whatever was going on with Ukraine. That Biden got billions of dollars from Ukraine, which flatly didn't happen. Now, one of the interesting things about this is we highlighted in that initial story that Gray Ricordi did 5 years ago that Biden was the point person with Ukraine. Obama didn't really talk to those people. He had delegated that to Biden. So in one respect, there was a lot of information and a lot of back and forth about Biden's relationship with the Ukrainian government. Obama also fobbed off talking to Turkish President Erdogan to Biden, basically because he found Erdogan so disagreeable and crazy, which is kind of like the downside of being vice president. You get the jobs that nobody wants to do. And see, Trump confirms that it happens. So anyway, this just goes to the challenges of covering this administration in terms of getting information. Places where you got information routinely before, you don't get now because once they realize that people use that in ways that they don't like, they stop doing it. They don't do press briefings anymore. I was asked in the previous class I talked to what I thought about that. And on balance, I always thought that these press briefings were kind of a joke, because people would go and do basically performance art and preen before the cameras, and it was mostly about them and less about the information. But even with that, you had a chance to hold people accountable by asking them a question. And their answers, while there might be lies, were still an opportunity to ask the question. And, to go back to the topic of my two books, one of the main sources of tension during the Nixon administration were those briefings with Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, in which he was asked a lot of embarrassing questions that he couldn't answer very well. And those weren't routinely televised like they are now. But at least you had the opportunity to ask people questions that you don't have now. One of the things that we were always successful with at USA Today was using that information to do stories that illuminated policies. And more, this administration makes it hard to do that, because they don't do what they, for years the defense secretary would have briefings. They stopped doing that. Only recently have restarted them. And mostly that was because Jim Mattis didn't want to answer questions that he thought would be embarrassing, because every time anybody talked to him, they were like, what do you say about the latest thing the president did? And he didn't want to answer the question, so he stopped talking to people. Another one that we did that won Gregory Cordy the Gerald Ford Award for White House reporting was a series of stories we did about President Obama's pardons and commutations policies. And he made a big initiative of getting people out of federal prison who didn't need to be there. And we wanted to know more about that. Were politics involved? Were they doing anything untoward? And we were like the only people writing those stories. And it got to the point where the White House was telling us what it was going to do before they did it. And the pardon attorney was telling us what was happening so we would know. And we were able to assemble a really good base of information. And now that doesn't happen. There is no process for pardons. It's whoever the president saw on TV. If it was somebody who had a celebrated case on Fox, in the case of some of these military officers. If it's Rod Blagojevich, who was a Celebrity Apprentice contestant, that's your standard. If you're the racist former sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, Joe Arpaio, you get a pardon. There's no rhyme or reason. There's no process. We couldn't do that story now because that information has been sealed off to us. And so when it comes to reporting on stuff in this information, they've made it far more difficult than it used to be. But there are still ways that you can do things that make a difference. One of the fundamentals that we did with all the reporters on every beat is to focus on certain themes within a beat. And like when we covered the Pentagon, one of those themes was senior officer misconduct. There were a lot of high-ranking admirals and generals who were doing things wrong, and sometimes just getting a slap on the wrist. They were allowed to retire with no kind of investigation. They were just like, okay, you go away. And nobody knew what happened, except for the people who worked with them, who knew exactly what happened. And what that was doing was sapping their confidence in the top leadership at the Pentagon. We said, we're going to look at this because we think it's a bigger problem. And in the course of doing that, we found out a lot of stuff. In one case, we were tipped off to, because we had written these stories before, we're tipped off to the fact that a 2-star general at the European command in Germany he had left his job. We didn't know why. But we knew that had happened. We knew it was weird. We started asking around, and we found a source who said he was caught having an affair. So we wrote the story that said he was having an affair with a subordinate. I think she worked for a contractor. That was an interesting enough story, and well then, because we were focusing on that, we had gained a reputation for looking at these stories. The girlfriend shows up. She's somehow offended by our story initially, not because it mentioned that he was having an affair, but it didn't quite adequately communicate the depth of their love for each other. And we're like, really? So she contacts our reporter with a variety of pieces of evidence of their intimacy that I cannot ever unsee, and gives it to us. Well, it turns out not only were they having an affair, but they were both habitués of a series of sex and swinger clubs around the country and actually around the world, where they would go and have group sex and all manner of other things. Now, if you've ever seen a spy movie, you know that intelligence services use women and sex traps to get information. And this guy is in the middle of something that's obviously a security risk, and yet they give him a slap on the wrist and they let him keep his security clearance. I mean, the reason why there's that law against having extramarital affairs is you are a potential blackmail target. You're a security risk. They didn't care. They let him keep his security clearance until we asked about it, and then they finally made it go away. Through the course of focusing on that, we've gotten a number of good stories that in this last summer culminated in the resignations of two of the top 5 people in the Pentagon. The incoming Defense Secretary, Patrick Shanahan, who was the acting Defense Secretary, had been nominated for the job, and the incoming Chief of Naval Operations. And the reason for that is because of our focus on that issue, we got tipped off about Shanahan's problems having to do with his divorce case, in which his wife attacked him and his high school age son hit his wife with a baseball bat. And none of that came out publicly. He was hiding it. Apparently, inside the Pentagon press corps, it was an open secret, but nobody wrote about it, which tells you something about what their priorities are. He wrote the story. It ran in the morning online, said this happened. An hour later was updated to say Trump had yanked his nomination. That all stems back to the focus on those kind of issues. The second one, which came like 2 weeks later, was that the incoming Chief of Naval Operations, the top admiral in the Navy, had retired after Tom Vandenbroek had asked for FOIAs of his emails with a former subordinate who was a spokesman, who we had written about a couple years ago. The spokesman at a December 2016 Pentagon Christmas party had dressed as Santa Claus, gotten extremely drunk in the middle of the day, and groped a bunch of women on the Navy press staff. There was an NCIS report which we got that came out like weeks later that cited him for his predatory behavior toward women, which the then Chief of Naval Operations knew. And he was protecting this guy for God knows whatever reason until we started asking about it. Then he got reassigned. And the incoming CNO, a guy named Bill Moran, had met with us off the record to tell us, oh, he's a good guy, whatever. We're like, sure he is. We wrote the story anyways. And then there was an Inspector General report that came out that sanctioned the Chief of Naval Operations for keeping the guy on the job, despite all these damning reports. Moran's coming in, and Tom asked for the communications between him and this former officer, Chris Cervello, because we knew that Moran was kicking business to this guy's new private PR shop, even though he had been fired for being a pervert. Well, faced with the revelation of that, he retired. So in the space of 2 to 3 weeks, one reporter who'd focused on information that was publicly available and had the drive to stay on target ended up knocking out 2 of the top people in the Pentagon. Nobody has had a more consequential year reporting on that topic than him. And that's a result of what you can do when you stay focused on things, even in an administration that doesn't want to tell you stuff. Because when people know that you're writing about it and you have demonstrated the ability to master that information, they're going to find you and they're going to tell you more information. So good reporting draws good information that leads to more good reporting. And that has happened on topic after topic that we worked on at USA Today, that we worked on at AP, and other places. That's the lesson from then, and that's the lesson, for now, even in an environment that's really hard to report. We'll draw a parallel between this administration and the one that I've written about recently. You hear a lot of people talk about, this is just like Watergate. Trump is just like Nixon. It's worse than Watergate, whatever. It is worse than Watergate, mostly because Watergate itself wasn't that big of a deal. Watergate is kind of a catch-all phrase for all manner of things that Nixon did during his presidency that actually started before he was elected president. In October of 1968, he actively worked to subvert the Paris peace talks to end the Vietnam War. He, through a surrogate, reached out to the South Vietnamese government and said, do not go to Paris. I'll give you a better deal. So they didn't go to Paris. They didn't get this breakthrough that would have helped Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic presidential candidate and vice president. And Nixon wins a popular vote by 500,000 and gets elected president. They say that if things had gone on for another week, Nixon probably would have lost. He didn't want to take that chance. He lied about that for the rest of his life. And that kind of original sin of his presidency colored everything he did during his presidency, and which is why when the Watergate break-in happened, involving many of the people who were doing other things for him, he had to cover it up, even though he had no idea why it had happened. He just bought into the cover-up. The big difference between Nixon and Trump, Nixon did almost all this stuff in private. Trump does it on Twitter. Find things on the White House tapes that Nixon said about people. The routine anti-Semitism, which still kind of blows my mind. Trump doesn't go that far, but he says that about other things. And did you see the story that came out in the last couple of months about Nixon talking to Ronald Reagan, in which Ronald Reagan talks about African diplomats barely just starting to wear shoes, which was kept, hidden to preserve the privacy of Ronald Reagan. That doesn't make any sense. And even in that, what we know now is Nixon was lying to Reagan, because all that whole controversy had to do with the acceptance of what we called Communist China as the sole representative at the UN of China instead of Taiwan. Well, that was Nixon's plan all along. He knew it was going to happen. He just pretended to Reagan that it was some big accident when it was his idea, and had gone to the extent of lying to the Taiwanese about it when they were nervous about Kissinger's trip to China. We hear something's going to happen, Well, yeah, this is what's happening. You're going to get kicked out of the UN, and we're all for it. The great thing about working on this now is all of this information is coming available that wasn't out, 5-10 years ago. In my first book, I talk about how Nixon testified before a grand jury in June of 1975. This was a grand jury looking into whether to charge former acting FBI Director Pat Gray with perjury. And Nixon testifies out at a Coast Guard station in San Clemente, California. Well, this had been classified until 2011. And people didn't know about it. And then when you find it, he talks about why he kept everything secret, because he couldn't have gotten anything done. And he did it on purpose, and kind of spells out his whole rationale. Well, this thing had been hidden for years, which is just a way that you can get stuff. We know that in this administration, there's going to be stuff like that. And things that you think that you know now that seem really bad might not be that bad, might not be bad at all. Things that you think are bad now are going to be worse. One of the things in this book, when Nixon tells Al Haig that he's taping everything in the White House on May 11th, 1973, which is also on the tapes, one of the reasons why he wants Haig to know about this is so they can burn Henry Kissinger, because Kissinger was disavowing knowledge of certain things the White House was doing. And Nixon's like, he's lying, it's driving me crazy. And then he throws in a routine anti-Semitic jab, and we're going to get him because of that. He needs to know about that. Well, they didn't tell Kissinger, and he kept on trying to distance himself. But one of the reasons why that's even more important now is it points to Al Haig's relationship with the media as a media source. If you read the book All the President's Men, Woodward and Bernstein talk about the revelation of the White House tapes. In particular, how damaging it would be to Henry Kissinger if people could hear what he said on the tapes. Well, no one could have heard that tape in which that conversation happened. Nixon didn't tell Bob Woodward that. There's only one other person in that room who could have told Bob Woodward about the Haig connection, and that was the guy who Nixon said he was going to use the tapes to hurt Henry Kissinger. It goes to what we now know is the relationship that Bob Woodward and Al Haig had even before Woodward became a reporter. When he was a Navy officer with a top secret military clearance, delivering messages from the Pentagon on behalf of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the White House basement and giving them to Al Haig. And the reason we know that is because Woodward's boss at the time, Admiral Thomas Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said so. Said it was his job. It's on tape. It's at an archive at Texas A&M University in Central Texas. Moore's boss, Melvin Laird, the defense secretary, said the same thing. As did Laird's spokesman, said that was Woodward's job. So here you have three people on the record saying his job was to meet with Al Haig, who then becomes White House Chief of Staff and starts providing information to the media nemesis of Haig's boss. Beyond that, found in here, in Woodward's own notes that were sold to the University of Texas, notes of a conversation between him and Al Haig on October 22nd, 1973. At the top of it says, General Haig, deep background. And in that conversation, Haig says to Woodward, I know you and your partner will treat me as fairly as you have in the past. So, the White House Chief of Staff has a deep background source relationship with the main reporter writing about Richard Nixon. Another thing that you find out now that wasn't available before is Haig, when he was Deputy National Security Advisor, had been helping rogue elements of the military steal documents from the White House about what Nixon was doing. Nixon didn't want them to know because he wanted to do it all in secret, but Haig was giving it to them. Bob Woodward knew about that in May of 1973. He interviewed the National Security Council liaison officer, a guy named Robert Welander, an admiral, who had been Woodward's commanding officer in the Navy, about it. Said, this is going to bubble up. What do you know? Welander said, I can't tell you anything about it. That was May of 1973. Woodward knew about it. How did he know? Probably because his friend Al Haig told him. He sat on that story until January of 1974. Somebody else broke the story before them. And when you analyze the post stories about that issue, written by Woodward and Bernstein, with the New York Times stories written by Seymour Hersh on the same topic, they're almost totally different. And who does Woodward's story absolve of any problem? Al Haig. Nowhere in there. So, and did Woodward say, I'm writing about my former commander and my former boss? Never. So here you got a guy who's writing about his former commanding officer, somebody that he has a relationship with, and not telling his boss. All this is information that has come out now. And so the relevance of that to what you see now is who's talking to these reporters about Trump and what's going on in the Trump administration, and why are they doing it? Who are they covering for? You know, are they covering for other people? Are they covering for themselves? You don't know what the motives are for those people, and it makes it very hard to trust that information because you don't know what they hope to get out of it. What's their agenda? Do they even know what they're talking about? And I think we saw with the Nixon administration, there were a lot of people who were doing that who got away with it, in part because a lot of people hated Richard Nixon. They wanted to believe the worst about the guy, and in a lot of cases, the worst wasn't even bad enough. He did worse things. But in other cases, he didn't do what they were saying he did. And I think we're going to find out, you know, to the extent that I'm still alive in 30 years, we're going to find out more about that with this administration too. And so as we go about reporting in Washington, I think it's incumbent on anybody doing that job that you know what the motives of your sources are, why you're writing about it, and that you may not be getting the accurate story. Because when you go back to write the history, it's a lot more complicated. And that's the lesson I think I've learned about, you know, doing these books and how it relates to what happens when, you know, you're a reporter and an editor in Washington now. And with that, I'd like to take any questions. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So, reporting from the White House, would you be willing to walk us through? So, you mentioned some of the readouts and the cancellation of press freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are some of the avenues that you can still get to? So, you are working within the White House. What are some of the opportunities that you have to, glean other information?
There's a number of them. When they put out an executive order or some kind of executive action, which could be something called a presidential memorandum, they still put those out. You can track the work done on those throughout various channels. There's a great government site called Federal Business Opportunities, fbo.gov. It's great. Every time the government wants something or does a contract, they have to put a notice on this website. And so you can go there and get email alerts on certain topics. And so you'll see from the executive office of the president, if they post something they're looking for, you can pull information from that. You can get insights into national security policies by what certain defense and other agencies are looking for, State Department, healthcare. If Medicare or HHS wants to do something with the Affordable Care Act, they'll put an announcement out there. And usually on these things are attachments that are that say, this is what we want. And so sometimes if you see a story that says, the Pentagon wants to, land something on Saturn to do whatever, it's in one of those documents. Now I'll tell a fun story about what I found in one of those. I had one that searched for things from called other defense agencies. And I was particularly interested in this think tank called the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, which is then run by this 90-year-old guy named Andrew Marshall. He's one of these little gnomes who works in government, who's been there forever. You don't know what he does. And it had some weird title on it. I forget what it was. And it was a contract award to a psychologist at Brown University, and it came through the Naval War College. So I looked at some of the supporting documentation and then looked through this other site to see how much money this guy had been paid. He had been paid a lot. And he was working with these people at the War College under a contract from the Office of Net Assessment. And they did something called movement pattern analysis research. So if I move a certain way, they would try to glean insights about that. If you asked me a question and I scratched my ear when I told a lie, that would be a tell. And so they were doing these on a bunch of foreign leaders, primarily Putin. And so I took that information, I wrote a story that says the Pentagon is studying the body language of foreign leaders to figure out what they're doing. And of course, nobody at the Pentagon really knew about this, and they were like, whoa, we don't know what to say. But there were reports on it that they had done. So I FOIA'd the reports. I got them a year later. And so I get the email, your FOIA's come in, and I'm looking at it on my phone, and I'm like, oh my God. They said Putin had Asperger's syndrome. So I'm like, that's a story. And so I run to the subway and I get on and I got the thing printed out and I'm writing the story in a notebook to get home, and that thing went nuts. It got 900,000 hits online. But it was all from that source of information, which we tapped for a bunch of cool stories. And sometimes you'll find something in there, it'll speak to the research and the analysis they're doing to make an executive order happen. And you can kind of piece all that stuff together. And so that's still out there because it's a routine function of government, and it's a place that they haven't identified as something they can stop. Yeah.
Regarding the phone call readouts,
Uh-huh.
how difficult was that to get from the Obama administration? And then as far as filing a FOIA and having to wait, and then what about historically speaking? Would other administrations pre-Obama routinely release this?
Yeah, they put out a release every time one happened, and they were all on the White House website.
Not even a FOIA.
Not even a FOIA, which is great because we'd probably still be waiting for it now. Every once in a while you get this email, do you still want this FOIA that you submitted in 2013? Yeah. But, yeah, so it was all there. So we scooped them up and we scraped them for telltale signs and analyzed them. And we could have gone back to the Bush administration if we wanted to, and I think we did kind of to establish some kind of baseline. And then all that dried up, which was unfortunate. Yeah.
Earlier this summer, I read David Rawls' book about being a lawyer for the New York Times and how challenges that they have had with the administration being hostile to their reporters and
Right.
lobbying and cease and desist. So I was wondering if you could talk about any kind of legal issues you've had with the administration.
Not really. We didn't, have those kind of hassles. We had just the routine not talking to us and, not being organized. We want to report on the policy. We don't want to write about all the White House intrigue. There's a never-ending supply of that, and it doesn't really inform anybody about anything. And so early on, we wanted to write about what the administration was doing about H-1 visas for foreign workers. We could not find anybody who would tell us about it. They didn't have a guy who did that, even though that was one of their big issues. We couldn't do the story the way we wanted to and really have their side of it because they couldn't present us with anybody. So the challenge wasn't necessarily that they were being obstructionist, just that they didn't have their act together. Yeah, that's at the White House. Now at the agencies with a lot of political people, we did a big project about VA nursing homes. There's 135 of them around the country. I didn't even know they had nursing homes. They have secret ratings for these nursing homes. They had them for 18 years and never told anybody about them. So if you're taking dad, who's a 90-year-old World War II veteran, to the nursing home, the VA nursing home in, Boston, and you don't know it's a 1-star facility, you're kind of rolling the dice. And they were very hard to deal with. They tried to basically burn us on our story. And it was extra complicated because we were doing that project with the Boston Globe simultaneously. So it ran in the Globe at the same time it ran in USA Today. And, we were like juggling all this stuff. And they released some of the information online. Nobody found it, but we knew it just to try to zap our story. That was frustrating. I don't know if they did that at the direction of the White House. I don't think so. I think it's because they just didn't want us to know or wanted to screw us over. And that story got immediate results, and now those things are public. We had an anecdote. One of the main anecdotes was this woman whose husband was a Vietnam veteran, and he had memory problems. He was a wanderer. He kept wandering out of the house, and she's like, so she goes to the nursing home in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is just east of Montgomery, and says, Earl wanders. We got to take care of him. And they said, it's fine. Well, one day they didn't lock the door. Earl wandered away into the woods, and they never found him again. They had to declare the guy dead. His wife doesn't know whatever happened to him. And she says, if I had known that you guys held this place in such low regard, I never would have taken my husband there. And that was one of the reasons why they were playing hardball on that. Yeah.
So I have two questions for you. First, how many stories don't get written? The reporter gets a lead, and they investigate, and they get some sources, but they just don't have enough to publish. So, how much do we actually, as readers of newspapers, see versus how much is actually done by journalists? And then second, you kind of occupy both worlds, journalism and history. Do you find that it's pretty much the same being a journalist versus being a historian? What have you found is different about journalism?
The first question is, a lot happens that you don't write about. Stories you think are going to be great kind of fizzle because you don't have the information you have, or you talk to somebody who gives you a very convincing explanation for why it's not a story. That happens. And it should happen, because if you ignore people like that and do the story that you think is there and it's not there, it's on you. And eventually you're not going to be working in journalism anymore. I don't know what you're going to be doing. So there's a lot of that. The second one is, being a journalist helped me as a historian because it helped me find information. And I think the thing that, I do best as a journalist is I'm a dot connector, and I notice patterns. And that helped me do that as an editor, as a reporter, and I think that helps me as a historian because I remember things that I saw somewhere else. I wouldn't say I'm the world's greatest writer. That's not my thing. But I can put together information and notice patterns, and that's been really helpful. I wanted to get to that before I forgot the answer. And to go back to the first part of that question is, there were a number of stories that we worked on that we didn't do that seemed very interesting. One was, we got an Inspector General report from the Pentagon, and it was about how this Air Force undersecretary was basically, the allegation was he was taking his subordinates frequent flyer miles to get upgrades that they couldn't get. So he would go sit in first class while they would be back in coach, and he was taking their miles. I'm like, that's gross. But I called the guy, who was then a lawyer at one of the big DC firms. I think it was Arnold and Porter. And when he explained it to me, And there were some bunch of pages redacted from this report too. I'm like, why? Well, it turns out the source was a well-known employee who was notorious for having mental illness. She was bipolar, and a lot of what she said just was not reliable. And I couldn't in good conscience write the story that I thought was there about this when I knew what he said had happened, and I believed the guy, so I didn't do it. There are other ones where people say, if you do this story, people will get killed because of it. Military stories. One was about this new kind of IED that the Iraqi insurgents had developed to basically take 2 metal baking trays that they, like bake pita bread on, and slap them around a piece of C4 and stick it under a road, and the pressure plate would hit and blow up an armored Humvee. And this was something new that we had learned from a government report. And we were asked them about it, and they go, oh God, don't write that story. That'll spread that information around Iraq. I'm like, well, how many of these guys read USA Today? But it was true that they can find a way to get that information. And so, look, I like to do aggressive stories, but when someone says, if you do this, someone's going to get killed, I don't want that on my head. We didn't do the story until the word had spread anyway, and then we did the story. So those are just 2 examples. Yeah.
So in an age when sort of information is so copious and travels so quickly, and the pressure is to come up with, to be the first to have the story, right? How do you balance sort of getting the story right while having it out in a timely manner and not having to sort of have the need for retractions later or sort of heavy edits that might hurt the sort of reputation of paper over time? So how do you balance those sorts of things?
It's hard. It's a constant juggling act. You want to be first because when you're competing for most of your readers online, the people who are first suck up a lot of those readers going to a story. Like, you rise higher in search. You rise higher in Google News. People see your alert first. You want to be out there first. You got to know your topic. You got to be fast, and you got to be organized. So, it was really tough at the beginning of the Trump administration. He's tweeting about anything, and we're, like slapping his tweets out there. And that's not a good way to be. So, as you get better at that, first of all, the tweet's probably not true, that there's context that needs to be there. You need experienced, knowledgeable reporters doing that, and it's not fun because he starts tweeting at 6 a.m. And lucky for me, I had a White House reporter who'd never seemed to sleep. We used to joke that he slept under his desk in the office because no one actually knew where he lived, and he looked like he had slept at the office. And so he and I would wake up and get on my iPad, and I would see the tweets, and I would email him or text him, and we would be back and forth. I wouldn't even be out of bed. What's going on? What do you think about this? Don't say this. Make sure you add this. Make sure that you add some detail, and let's get it up as fast as we can, and then add to it. So the story is never static. It's this constantly changing organism throughout the day as you get more information. And then a lot of times as you got to the mid-afternoon, you would totally rewrite the story, away from President tweets X, other people say Y, to kind of the richer issue involved. So the story, if you called that story up online now, you wouldn't see the story that first ran because it would be different. It would, unless we created a separate URL for it, it would be that story. It's exhausting.
So just to sort of follow up.
Yeah.
So you explained the sort of short-term news
Right.
stories pretty well there. I think that dynamic makes sense. How about sort of more long-term issues, something comparable to Watergate, where you're having to come up with bits and pieces of the story as you go along, so you want to come up with something and be first to have something substantive there, but you don't have all the
Mm-hmm.
And the story, like as you mentioned, right, the reporters would sit on it, but they weren't
Right.
sure. But there was also a different sort of relationship they had, where they didn't have the same pressures to
Right.
publish Watergate immediately, right? So how do you? Is this just something that journalists have to deal with now? Or?
Yeah, you got to deal with it. You got to. It forces you as an editor working closely with reporters to balance doing the daily stories with what your long-term agenda is, what your goals are. And with every reporter I worked with, I tried to focus them on 3 or 4 things inside of that beat that we think are the most important, and keep going back to them as we can. Unless news totally blows us out of the water. And like a lot of times that works. So you just don't lose focus on what you think is important. And as you do these daily stories, you notice stuff that shows a bigger story. This is the 3rd time he said this. This indicates a shift in policy. What can we find to illuminate that? We were doing stuff on trade and tariffs a year and a half, 2 years ago, because we knew that was going to be a big deal. And it has become a bigger deal, bigger than we even thought. But because we knew that was something where that was going to go. And that happens over a period of time. And as you keep doing it, it pays off. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering your opinion on how social media and how it kind of democratized people's ability to post news stories.
Uh-huh.
How that's affected journalism as a whole for better or worse.
I think it's a real mixed bag. On the one hand, there's a lot of garbage out there. But look, I'm on Twitter all the time. I use Twitter to get a lot of news. Not what people say about a story, but the link to the story itself. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that was out there. That's great. Using it to actively mislead people, not so great. And how it can spread rumors in a way that's really hard to stop, that's a problem. But, social media is just a different iteration of how people communicate. There's always been something that people freak out about. Oh, my God, radio. Radio is going to be the ruin of everything. TV, the penny press. There's always something. And what makes this so challenging is stuff that you would never have heard about 10, 15, 20 years ago, you find out about all the time. And it seems like, oh my God, there's this crazy pattern. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's just not. Like, people post all these videos about someone acting like an idiot and being a racist, and they're coming from all over, and you never would have known about that 10 years ago. And I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but it creates the impression, that everybody's totally become unhinged, or either confirms something you already know, that yes, there are tons of people out there like that, but it could be something else. It could be violence or some kind of gun crimes or whatever, you name it. The accessibility of that information in a way that we haven't had to deal with can really be overwhelming sometimes. And, I remember when I was a student here, and Hugh Culberson, one of the journalism professors, talked about the mean old world theory from watching TV news. That, oh my God, the world has gone mad. It's crazy. And, like something out of Network. And you can feel that way through social media sometimes because of the immediacy of it all. And how do you create a filter to help you absorb that information better and discern what's true and what's not true is a real challenge. Yeah.
Sorry,
No.
What about like independent journalists? Not so much like social media for content, but social media for independent journalists. Like, how does that change the dynamic between like established media outlets versus like an individual with a YouTube channel or 10 individuals who have started a website?
I think that's great in most cases. I think the challenge for the readers of that is you don't know who these people are. And it's great to be independent, but, you know, what's the standard? Well, one of the great things about journalism is there is no entry test. There's no license. You can do it, whatever, and that's, I think, a good thing. But, you know, I see stuff online, on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and I'm like, who are these people? You know, and I don't know what the source is. And, you know, you see people throwing it around all over the place as gospel, and you don't know where it's coming from and what their standards are. So on the democratization part of it, that's great. But you have to be discerning as you know, digest that information to make sure that you can trust where you're getting it from. You know, and my bias as a member of legacy media is I know what I had to do to get the jobs that I had, and I know what the people who worked with me had to do to get those jobs, and some of those other people, I don't know that. So it makes me initially skeptical, which I think all of us should be anyway. Yeah.
This is kind of just a fun question, but what are your thoughts on the White House Correspondents' Dinner and the fact that they had a historian this year, not a comedian, and the fact that the president doesn't bring him in, and how does that affect the relationship between the White House and the journalists?
Well, this is a topic I know a lot about. Up until this year, I had gone to every correspondence dinner between 2005 and 2018. For reasons that had nothing to do with the WHCA, it had gotten out of control, mostly because groups that had their own interests had piggybacked events all around it to take advantage of people being there for that. And that wasn't the WHCA's fault. That was those other people's fault. They turned it into this crazy circus. My ex-wife was the president of the Correspondents Association last year when Michelle Wolf was the comedian. And that was a major headache for her because she worked really hard at putting on a good dinner, and I don't think Michelle Wolf said anything that wasn't true. She probably could have said it in a different way, and that is a hard room to do, you know. But all these people go out and say the same stuff out in the hallway that, oh, now I'm so offended by, you know. That's a joke. We all know it. But, you know, the president's right there. You don't want to be that rude. You know, Trump could go and have a good time, and it would be fine. He went to the Gridiron dinner last year. I was at that, and he talked for way too long, but it was fine. People were respectful. It's one of these weird rituals in D.C. that has been around for a long time, and it has some kind of outsized role in what we do, but it doesn't corrupt the reporters who go there because you take some White House official or government official and you sit there with them. I mean, you're having a conversation. They're not going to be your best friend. They're not going to tell you stuff. Oh, I had dinner with Admiral Mike Mullen, and now I'm going to do everything the Pentagon wants. No. You know, I do know that one of our reporters took a previous director of national intelligence to the dinner, and they had such a good time that he took a buyout from USA Today and went to work for a guy as a spokesman. That was great, you know, but he was going to take the buyout anyway. And he's gone on to have a good career in the intelligence community after that. I think a lot of people just got really bent out of shape about it in ways that didn't make sense. It was surreal with Obama because so many people wanted to be around him that, you know, you'd be in the bathroom, oh, there's John Hamm, you know, whoa. And that's kind of fun, but then, you know, at midnight and your carriage turns into a pumpkin and you go home. It's like no big deal. Yeah.
Somewhat different and maybe crashing that mic before I was probably well, I would say all-time low, but here we are in 2019, and that might have
Right.
we might top it or low it. But it seems to me that in the context of Watergate and the aftermath of Watergate, there was fairly widespread trust in the media
Mm-hmm.
in the country, and that doesn't seem to be the case in the current environment.
Right.
I just sort of wonder what that means for how we even process current events.
I hope and I think it'll get better once this administration ends, whenever it does, whether it's 2021 or 2025. I think if Trump loses next year, that a lot of people who supported him, particularly kind of just because they're Republicans and he's a Republican, they are going to forget they even heard about the guy. And I think most of those people know that the reporting about him is true. I think that most Republican members of Congress know that it's true. And the reason I know that is they would tell my reporters that and then go out on camera and say the exact opposite. Oh, he's crazy. But he's for a tax cut, and so am I. And so I think the people who are hardcore supporters of this president had the same attitudes toward the media before. You know, I can't tell you how many times in the course of my career, like, why do people believe X? You know, who are these people? Why can't we reach them? You know, why are they believing this something that's absolutely not true because it was a flyer stuck on their windshield at a state fair? There's always some kind of medium that communicates that message. There are always people who are going to believe it. There are always people that, you know, we despair about not being able to reach. And you go back and you look at history and you're like, you know, in this book, you go back and look at some of that and you're like, wow, that was crazy. And people are like, oh, it's never happened before. Yeah, it did. It happened then. Joe McCarthy, I mean, I wasn't alive when it happened, but I read about it. I know what's happened to those people. That was insane. You know, you go back and read stuff during the Roosevelt administrations, FDR and TR, and there are people who pop up and you go, that guy was nuts. Who was that person? You know, and he would be a committee chairman or something and derail a policy. And we forget about that. And so I think the speed with which information travels makes us more conscious of it and more despairing about the future. But I think we've been dealing with the same kind of problems before, and I think, you know, the pendulum goes back and forth, and I think it'll go back in favor of the media. I hope it does. You know, it's how I've made my living, and I don't like people to think I'm not telling the truth. Yeah.
Sort of related. It's also sort of a pessimistic question. I mean, for the vast majority of U.S. history, the press was basically just sort of the adjunct of the party.
Right.
Or sectional interest. And really, this sort of notion of an objective press is sort of an artifact of this 20 to 30 year consensus, or tentative consensus from the end of World War II up to sometime in the early 70s, maybe.
Right.
Is this just a reversion to the norm? Is that how you view things, or do you think that there's a sort of role that we can have a return to sort of objective press where everyone believes in Walter Cronkite again, essentially?
I don't know if we're ever going to get to that because there are so many different sources of information, so many different media out there that the level that you were known before is different than now. You know, I was watching a documentary about Elvis a few months ago with my daughter who's 15. She knows who he is. But I was saying, when you were famous, when he was famous, you were famous. Everybody knew who you were. There were 3 TV channels. If you were on it, everybody knew who you were. Now it's like you go to the grocery store, and if you look at some of these supermarket tabloids while you're checking out, you're like, who is that guy? You know, I don't know who that is. He's on every magazine. I don't know who that person is, you know. If you don't watch that one cable channel or something else, there are people that you've never heard of yet. They have achieved a level of notoriety that is hard to fathom. So I don't think we're ever going to have that universality of, popularity or notoriety. I think in a lot of cases that the kind of political dialogue has warped what is objective. I think the New York Times is extremely objective. Trump is president, so they seem adversarial now. But it wasn't that long ago when Democrats were complaining about, why are you writing so much about Hillary's emails? Why are you doing this and doing that? That happens all the time. And that doesn't mean they're not objective. It just means, they're doing their jobs. And I think we'll still have that. And I hope that, these institutions remain healthy enough to be able to do that, so we don't, kind of degenerate into having smaller and smaller groups that have a clear political agenda, and you can't find a neutral arbiter to help you make sense of that information. All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
So one of the USA Today pop-ups suggested that the impeachment proceedings been called
Oh, wow.
about 20 minutes